Welcome everyone to WLT on the Craft of Writing, Short Fiction, a conversation with Chaitali Sen and Kirk Wilson. My name is Sam Babiak, and I'm the Program Director for the Writers League, and I'll be moderating this conversation. But before we get started, I'm going to take a moment to introduce our panelists for the evening. So first up, Chaitali Sen is the author of the novel The Pathless Sky and short stories and essays which have appeared in Boulevard, Colorado Review, Ecotone, Lit Hub, Los Angeles Review of Books, New England Review, Shenandoah, and other publications. Her story collection, A New Race of Men from Heaven, was selected by Danielle Evans as the winner of the 2021 Mary McCarthy Prize for Short Fiction and is forthcoming from Sarabande Books in January 2023. It's already out, actually. And The Pathless Sky was a finalist for the Texas Institute of Letters Award for Best First Fiction and included on Ida Novi's BuzzFeed list 10 books that challenge our political landscape by inventing new ones. Library Journal's Top Fall Indie Fiction and Mike.com's 25 Essential Reads to make women's history last longer than a month. She holds an MFA in fiction from Hunter College and lives in Central Texas. Thanks so much for being here, Choidi.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
All right, and our second panelist for the night, Kirk Wilson's books include the story collection Out of Season, the poetry collection Songbox, the poetry chapbook, The Early Word, and Unsolved, a nonfiction crime study published in 6 editions in the US and UK. Kirk's fiction, nonfiction, and poetry are widely published in literary journals and anthologies. His awards include an NEA Fellowship, the Elixir Press Fiction Award, the Trio House Press Trio Award, Editors Awards, and other prizes in all 3 genres, and 2 Pushcart nominations. Kirk's website is www.kirkwilsonbooks.com. Thanks so much for being here, Kirk.
Sam, thank you. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's come in.
Absolutely. So let's get started. We're talking about short fiction today, and I would love to hear from you both first how you came to short fiction. And because you also write other forms and genres, I'm really curious about how the short story form fits into your storytelling. So Choidi, I'll start with you.
So yeah, that's a great question. The funny thing I've been thinking about lately is how people talk about not really reading short stories, yet short fiction is how most of us come into literacy. And that's true for me. I loved listening to folk and fairy tales. I used to love my little reading group readers with the little, short stories in there. And so when I decided at the age of 11 or 12 that I was going to start writing, I started attempting the short story form. And it was really only much later that the novel became dominant in my reading and writing. So I guess I started out with a love for the short form, with, being able to, finish reading a story in 12 or 15 pages or less. And I think it's just a beautiful form. It's so versatile. It's so artful. And so I do write both novels and short fiction, and I do them simultaneously. So while I have a short novel, I'm always working on short fiction, just because I have a lot of story ideas and I can't write that many novels. Yeah, so that's sort of how I look at it, but it's just a form that I love.
Thank you. Kirk?
Well, I spent most of my writing career thinking of myself as a poet and only kind of dabbling in fiction and nonfiction, but I got a little more serious about it as I went on and submitted to some magazines and got some work accepted and then got excited about it. And these days I do probably half my time doing fiction and half my time doing poetry. I love the short story form. To me, it's just it's a delight to work in because it's so malleable and because you can work with it until you get it right. I've done a couple of novels. I haven't published novels, but I have a couple of novels that are fermenting in the desk, and so I know what it is to try one of those. And they get, for me at least, they get kind of unwieldy at a point and kind of monstrous to deal with. Whereas a short story, you can kind of keep in touch with it and keep working on it until you feel like it's done. There's a quote from, I think I saw the other day, who's well known, of course, as a short story writer. She says, the novel hardens as you go. At a certain point, the ambitions, even the shape, begin to feel inevitable. The short story case phase through it. And I think that is an important thing. It's a chance to really get something right in a short story.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And we're definitely going to come back to that malleability that you're talking about. But to really dive into our discussion of this craft, we asked a lot of the audience to read 2 of your short stories, one from each of you. And that's The Catholics by Chaitali and Tapioca by Kirk Wilson. And so I'd love to hinge some of these questions on these short stories. But for those in the audience who maybe didn't get a chance to read them, please know that that's totally okay. But I'm wondering if you all could just tell us a little bit about these stories and follow that with where the stories began for you. What sparked these ideas? So Chody, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, so my collection is 8 stories. The oldest one is like 20 years old. It's called Uma. It's about a widow from India who comes to live with her brother. And then the newest one is one called A Century Ends, about 2 teachers, and it actually went through some pretty heavy editing for the collection. The Catholics is sort of in between there, 5 years old. And so they're all stories that have just been sort of in the works for the amount of time that I have been calling myself a writer. And have been on the journey of writing and publication. So the Catholics, which was reprinted in electric literature after, I think maybe the same day, same week that the collection came out, is about a couple, Lori and Sharmila, and they're speculating about their neighbors who are Catholic, and but they don't know what their politics are, if they voted for Trump. And so to answer your question, this story came from after Trump's election, just thinking about what happened and how to relate to people that maybe you don't know so well. Yeah, that's what that story's about.
Yeah, thank you. And that part about relating to people, it's so clear that is what that story is really talking about. And it's so wonderful. Thank you. Kirk, what about you?
Well, the first thing to know about the version of Tapioca that you can see online is that it's just an excerpt. I think the magazine put it out that way as a teaser, but there's quite a bit more to the story than what you can see online. If you want to read the whole thing, you can find it in my book, or you can find it in that issue of Story magazine, which is the most recent issue of that magazine. It's a pretty simple story, really. It's a story of conflict where one person wants what another person has, right? And that happens all the time in the world. I did have a lot of fun playing with the form of it and the language of it. I was kind of inspired. First of all, I discovered a newspaper story. That's what got me started on it. A newspaper story about a car dealer who was having problems with a mistress who was blackmailing him, and he hired a security guy who worked for him who subcontracted with a couple of special ops retired soldiers to get rid of the mistress, and they did that. And that case is now gone to trial. I'm a crime writer, by the way, so I pay attention to those things as well. But that story, I thought, needed to be fictionalized in some way. So it translated into the story about the botanist and the developer wants to get rid of the botanist because he wants his cafeteria. And I read a novella by Dorte Nors called Minna Needs Rehearsal Space, which is made of 1-sentence paragraphs. And I thought, that's pretty exciting. I like the way that works. I'm going to try that out. So I tried it out on this story. And also in my poetry these days, I don't use punctuation. So I thought I'd try that out too. So it's one sentence paragraphs with no punctuation. I had a lot of fun playing with the story and getting it right and getting to know the botanist a little bit more. So,
Yeah, thank you. There's
so
a lot
that's
that, yeah, there's a lot that we're definitely going to dive into, especially the influence of your poetry on this particular story.
Mhm.
So I love what you said earlier, Chaitali, about how you have all of these story ideas, and I'm very curious what happens after that. So how do you prepare yourself to write a short story? Do you outline, make plot points? Do you kind of figure it out along the way because it is so much shorter? And Chaitali, for you, I've heard you say before that if you don't know early on what you're trying to say, it often means that a story might not get finished. And that really stuck with me. So I'm curious, like, what that whole process looks like for you when you're just beginning.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long process for me, so it might be longer for me than it is for Kirk or other short story writers. I should say that first, I think I have to live with I usually have a character in mind and a place or a situation, and then I have to live with that character for a while and just daydream, imagine. And then once I have a first paragraph, I really start to work out a first paragraph. Once I have a first paragraph, it's usually okay, my odds go up to 50% that I'm going to finish the story. I don't outline or think of a structure first. The few times that I've done that, it just has not worked out well. The story didn't work. I don't know if it was too constraining. So I just then figure out sentence by sentence, and it's a lot of trial and error. Okay, what if I add this character? What if, they go to this place? And it's sort of a long, arduous process. About halfway through, when I'm like, I don't know what's supposed to happen next, that's when I'll really start to look at the structure a little bit, really start to figure out, what am I trying to say? What is this about? And I'll ask myself a lot of questions and just work stuff out in a notebook, on paper, do some journaling. And then then once I figure out, okay, this is what the story's about, then I usually have a better idea, and it's sort of then the downhill slide towards the end. So.
Thank you. Can you expand on that a little bit? Just like, what kinds of questions do you ask yourself in that process?
Yeah. So like, what's the problem? What is the problem that the character is facing? Am I framing this problem correctly? If this is the problem, then why is this happening in the story? Does that belong? Who should come in here? Or why is this character why does this character keep intruding on the story? Why does this character keep appearing? And so sometimes I find that what I thought the story was about is not what it's about, or where I actually wanted to go. So it's a lot of why questions and then a lot of how questions.
Got it. Thank you. That's really helpful. Kirk, what about you? How do you prepare to write a short story?
Well, I'm not a big outliner either. Oftentimes my stories start with just a line that comes to me out of the air. Oftentimes that's where my poems started. Sometimes my poems and my stories kind of cross-pollinate one another because something I've been thinking about or something I read will inspire things in both of those kinds of writing. Sometimes it's a situation, like in tapioca, but that's not really usual for me. I get started usually with a little bit of dialogue, a little bit of situation, and just kind of figure it out as I go. If I get stuck, I might make a list of things that might happen next, and pick one of those and go with that. I do revise a lot, but I don't tend to tear up stories and start over. Oftentimes in the editing process, I find I discover what the story is about. I didn't really know, which is kind of surprising at times, but I discover in the editing process that something comes out and says, okay, this, you need more of this. This is where it needs to go. And I follow that.
Thank you. All right, so I want to talk about structure a little bit now. And I liked what you were saying again, Chaitali, about how the structure kind of comes after that. And so I'm curious how you find the structure for your short stories, or, if you set out with a structure in mind, once you've kind of figured out this is kind of what I'm talking about, and you try to fill that container with a story, or if you work backwards. And I've heard you say before, like the short story is like putting together a puzzle because it's so compressed. But I think that can also be a lot of fun. So what does structure look like for you, Chaitali?
Well, I usually have an idea of the time frame. So, is this a story that takes place over a day, over a summer, over a weekend? And that usually suggests a little bit of the structure, like where the rising action is going to be, or where there's what is going to be the climax, even though my stories aren't exactly structured in that way, but where's the turning point going to be, stuff like that, how many events are there going to be, in what order, stuff like that. And then after that, I really, again, have to discover what the story's about. When I get to an end, then I will look at sort of what might change structurally. So, maybe it's I want to slow something down, or I want more of a arc. Or I want something that's not so easily resolved. So, yeah, I don't, I've never actually tried to like draw pictures of the structures of my story. So I would love for somebody to tell me how my stories are structured, but yeah. So, but I think that's probably one of the last things I work on before line editing. Yeah, I don't know. What about you, Kirk?
I'll go along with that too. And if you want to talk about how your stories are structured, just give me a call. Easier for me to talk about yours than about mine, I'm sure. I just start writing the story, and the structure builds around it. I don't worry too much about structure until I'm quite a ways on. And then sometimes at the very end, again, in the editing process, I may realize the end would work better in the middle or something like that. But I don't normally take stories apart very much. Although there's one story of mine that's in the book called Banquo's Ghost. I worked on that story for literally 10 years. At one point, it was a novel, and it went through all sorts of exacerbating troubles and so forth until finally it took the form that it has in the book. So it got cut up and put back together again several times. New characters came in, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not normal for me. Usually it goes a little smoother.
Awesome. I'd love to hear you talk specifically about the structure of tapioca. We did ask the audience for questions ahead of time, and someone did wonder about your objective behind using those like separate sentence forms. And so for those of you who maybe have not looked at the story, a lot of it is like one sentence after one sentence. There are some smaller paragraphs, but it is a really interesting structure. So how did that come about for you?
Once I started working that way, I realized that I liked the way, one, that it was a pretty quick read, and you can go back and read it again and get another level of meaning out of it, maybe. And the other thing is, as with poems, the meaning tends to build as each line goes on. One line will add another meaning, or perhaps line 10 will reflect back on line 1, and so forth. I liked the way that was working. I like kind of the music of that. The other thing is I'm a nut about language and using language, probably because I'm a poet, getting the rhythm on music of each line just right. So that was an opportunity to worry more about that sort of thing than to worry about kind of story elements, because the story's coming out, but the form is giving new levels of meaning as the story comes out.
Right. And I'll stick with you, Kirk, again, because I think precision of language is really important in short story writing. You don't have a lot of time to build character, world build, create emotional resonance. Every single word really counts.
Right.
And tapioca, I could really see the influence of your poetic background in that. And so can you talk a little bit about crafting language itself when it comes to short story writing?
Yeah, of course, I love language, and to me, sometimes as a reader, sometimes the language is more important than the story. That may sound a little bit heretical, but it's true. I'm reading a story a novel by John Banville right now. It's called The Singularities, and I come in and out of interest with the story. It's not that spellbinding, but the language, the writing is like going to school. It's like a class. And oftentimes I read for that, and I love that. It's just breathtaking language. And learning those techniques, watching those techniques and what it does is just amazing. I think whether your story is straightforward or lyrical, it really doesn't matter. The play of language can do as much to hold and involve the reader as even the plot. And also, I think language deepens the experience of reading a story, because you have all the toolkits that writers can use available to you to build on meanings that are going on, build multiple levels of meaning, do all kinds of things that reflect on something else and create harmonies or disharmonies with something else and so forth, all as a part of using the language. And I think that's really, really important in short stories because they are short stories.
Thank you. How do you think about language, Troy, especially with like your novel background and all of that when it comes to short stories? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have to be more compressed. And I think in a short story, you do want to give, the order of information and how you convey that information. There's another level of thought to it in the short story. And for me, I think it's important to figure out what does the reader need to know in order to get immersed into the story and get involved in what's happening. So the beginning of a short story, I think, is really important to me, and I mean to everybody. But I think of like some of the classic short stories where they just tell you what you need to know off the bat. Okay, who is this about? Where are we? Give the reader some grounding. And if you can do that with sentences that really, I think sentences themselves also have a momentum to them. And I'm with Kirk. There are some stories where I don't care that much about what's happening, but the sentences are so compelling. So you want to think on all those levels, but mainly you're trying to convey information. And I want the reader to get enough information to just get into the story. And that's going to be less information than you get in a novel, in fewer pages. I also think the endings are really important to me. I want the endings to sound lyrical. I want them to sound like an ending. And so, I like at the, I'm sure Kirk does this towards the end, you're reading it out loud to see how it sounds. Does it sound like a story? And does it sound like it's hurtling towards a conclusion?
Thank you. All right, so I would love to talk a little bit about characters and point of view in short stories. So one of my favorite short story writers, Chelsea Beaker, she said in an interview that she's always trying to find the most interesting perspective in the room when it comes to writing short fiction. And so I'd love to hear about the way that you thought about the characters in your short stories, Tapioca and the Catholics. And I'll come back to you, Kirk, because the botanist and the developer are basically the main characters in the story, but we don't have names for them or anything like that, but they are still so memorable and singular. And so how did you go about building those characters?
Well, again, as I went along, and as far as well, those two characters I think had to be at opposite ends of a spectrum to begin with, right? The botanist had to be a guy who wouldn't care at all about developing a property, and the developer had to be a guy who wouldn't care at all about plants. And so they couldn't exist in the same universe. They had to have a battle, and they do. As far as point of view is concerned, I guess I'm a little perverse in that I like to shift points of view, and I like when I'm reading to see, shifts in points of view. In tapioca, for example, the plants have a point of view, and for example, they express that point of view. I don't know what that is. So when I'm in a scene, I may want to go from a sort of a close third to an omniscient point of view and maybe shift back and forth. I may want to look around in that scene and say, what's the point of view of the plant? What's the point of view of the dog? Because dogs and plants do have points of view after all, and I'm curious what they are. So I like to play with that. To me, that's fun, and I think it's fun as a reader too.
Absolutely. And I think it shows like how exciting short stories can be. And I'm sure like you can do this in novels too, but in short fiction, like you have this contained space where you can switch between characters and think about what the plants are thinking. And it is all really exciting and it really works. Chaitali, what about you?
Yeah, so in the Catholics, it starts with for a third person plural kind of point of view. It's from the perspective of both Laurie and Sharmila as a collective, and then it goes back to that at the end. In the middle, it's mainly from Sharmila's point of view. I think like building character, for me, it's just from writing and having them talk to each other, having them interact with the environment, it's completely, I as a writer have to get sucked into the story, and as I'm sort of telling myself the story, the characters start to emerge and talk to me and as they talk to each other, and they start, it's a sort of mysterious, but they just start doing stuff, and sometimes something comes out that you don't expect. For example, Sharmila has a reaction to how many kids this woman has and this notion of motherhood and this cult of motherhood. And I didn't go in saying I'm going to write about a character who's, disturbed by women who have lots of kids, but that just emerged. So I think it's just from the process of imagining and writing.
Thank you. And so your characters are not living in a vacuum. And although the short story form is pretty short, there is still world building to be done. And you do need to be thinking about setting, unless your goal is to really make it entirely internal, which I've seen people do. But I'm wondering, what are the kinds of like details or things that you think about when you're world building in such a short period of time and space? And Trudy, I can stick with you.
Yeah, so I was speaking a little bit about this earlier. I think it's just initially, what is the information that the reader needs to get started? So who's in the story? Where are they? Maybe what time period is, build a little context. I personally like stories that are very rich and descriptive. And I mean, I like minimal stories too, but I grew up reading like Edgar Allan Poe and all those people. So I like a description of a vase or whatever. If it helps the story, I don't think you can go on forever just describing things. But so as I want to recommend to the listeners this one chapter in the book Art of Subtext, which is one of these Grey Wolf Press Art of series. It's called The Art of Staging, and it's really about building scenes moving characters around and, having them interact with the environment, the geographic space, and objects. And so that's very influential to me. So when I'm building a world in a short story, it's all through the movement of the characters and the movement of the characters through the story.
Thank you. That's a great point. We want to be connected and in the bodies of our characters as well. And that's a great way to think about it. Kirk, what about you? How do you think about world building?
Well, I tend to be a little bit more of a minimalist. It's easy for me to say too. But I don't like reading things where the author is telling me everything. I don't need to know everything. It's more fun for me as a reader to kind of intuit things and make intuitive leaps about things and that sort of thing. So I think that's fun, especially in short stories, where you can leave open spaces and trust your reader to understand what's going on around the room. You may want to describe a vase, that's fine, especially if the vase is interesting, but you don't need to describe the whole room and the whole setting and that sort of thing. I think you can build the world using the reader's imagination to help you. And I do trust the readers to be able to do that. And I think a short story is a perfect space for that.
Thank you. All right. So in all of this writing, we're kind of building towards the ending, and endings can be really difficult for a lot of writers. And I've heard people talk about, endings being, they need to be like both surprising, but also inevitable. And that sounds kind of impossible, but it's not. And I think, the ambiguity at the end of the Catholics, like that sort of not still knowing exactly what their politics are and stuff like that was so wonderfully done, Chaitali. And we did get a question in the Google form from an audience member asking, what advice do you have for figuring out and writing the best ending for a short story? So what are your thoughts on endings and how do you accomplish a good one?
So endings are so important, and I mean, honestly, I remember endings of stories more than I remember beginnings. I don't think that's uncommon. So I think there's two things. There's the end of the story, so the end of the action, and then there's the end of the I don't know what to call it exactly, but there's the end of the action and the end of the story, I guess. Right. And the end of the story is more of an emotional, you're ending on a certain emotional note. So I think one piece of advice I would give is what is the arc of the main characters or the protagonist's emotion, and try to encapsulate that in your last paragraph. And if things are unresolved, let them be unresolved, but there should be a moment of discomfort there. If the character is, if it's a happy ending, then let us feel some joy at the end. So I guess that's my one piece of advice here.
Thank you. Kirk, what advice do you have for writing endings?
I think one main thing, first of all, endings are hard. And I'm not particularly fond of endings that come to a full stop. I like endings where in the reader's mind, the story is still going on. So open-ended in a sense, but I also think it's very important what Chaitali said about being true to the feeling of the story, being true to the story, so that the emotion, or the weirdness or the mystery or whatever it is that's going on rings out at the end. Endings, by the way, don't have to come at the end. Endings can happen in the middle, and the story can go on and sort of wrap back around, so that we get filled out on how we got to that ending that happened in the middle. There's no rule that says they have to happen on the last line. One thing I find about endings too is going back and looking at them, I tend to write an ending line that I think is just great, and then 10 edits later I'll look at it and say, that doesn't belong, and I end up ending the story by striking the last line. Oftentimes that works.
Thank you. All right, so we are going to switch gears a little bit just because we did get a lot of questions about writing a collection and submitting short stories. And so I'm wondering if you could give the audience some advice about submitting short stories. I think how to find the right literary magazines was a big question, as well as how to deal with rejection. Because in the short story world, you're probably going to get rejected at least a few times. So Chaitali, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, so it's taken me a long time to learn how to do this, but I started just by submitting to journals that I was familiar with, and it was the Asian Pacific American Journal in New York, where I was taking classes at the Asian American Writers Workshop, saw the journal, submitted, and then you gain familiarity, hopefully, with more and more literary journals, because they're very important. And I have gone through many subscriptions. I don't subscribe to all of them all the time. You can also find them at the library. You can look at their online content. So that's number one. I think it is very critical to look at what kind of stories get into literary journals, and then that becomes your model. Not that you have to write exactly like those people, but it gives you an idea of the bar. And then just, try various, it's really important to submit. And I have submitted everywhere. I submit often. I've submitted and gotten published in some places where probably the story wasn't ready. But it's no big deal. You go and you write your next good story and you get it out to somewhere else. So you just gotta do it. And then the more you get rejected, the easier it gets.
Kirk?
Well, I'm kind of a submissions wonk. I have a personal system that's evolved over time that I use, and I have 15 different spreadsheets going on all the time that are managing my submissions, and it's work, but I enjoy it. It's just something, it's fun to do, and you really do have to have a thick skin and treat it as a business, because you'll get rejected 100 times more than you get accepted. So every once in a while, you'll get rejected only 5 times more than you're accepted, and that's very nice, but that's not the rule. And in terms of setting up those spreadsheets, I set up priorities. You can find various websites online where you can see the magazines that have the most success getting into the pushcart anthology, for example. And you can rank your spreadsheet that way, so that you have the Paris Review at the top, and Gauchers and Conjunctions and One Story, and all those magazines are somewhere near the top. And you can do your submissions in that order. I often do that, working around ones that just wouldn't work for that particular piece. But I often do that and do send out submissions in batches. It's important to send them out as they want to see them. In other words, the length that they want to see, not exceeding the maximum, doing all the things that they say to do. Some of them want you to have your name and your, contact information on every page. Some of them don't. Some of them want it blind, so forth and so on. So, read very carefully what the submissions guidelines are for each, and do exactly what it says. Have a thick skin and go about it, as fun. It's a fun thing to do. And every once in a while you'll have success, which is more fun.
Awesome. Thank you. That is great advice. All right. So let's talk a little bit about your collections. So we did get a question about how you go about putting your short story collection together. What did you use to organize those stories? But I'm also wondering if we can start a little bit earlier than that. Like, did you set out to write a collection in the first place? Or did you just kind of realize, oh, I have all of these short stories that I think could maybe be put together? What did that process look like for you? And then how did you start kind of putting it together in the first place?
Or which one of us? Me? Well, I a few years ago had assembled a stack of short stories, and some of them had been published and so forth. And as I looked at them, I realized that they were all, in one way or another, they could all be called love stories. So I called that collection Smash and Grab: Love Stories. And nobody published that collection, which was a great shock to me. So I kept it and put it in the drawer. And a couple of those stories, the title story, which is called Smash and Grab, and a couple of others found their way into this new collection. The new collection, same process. I had a stack of stories. Some of them had been published, and I felt good about all of them. I felt that all of them really were ready to go. And I realized that all of them were just a little bit off. All of them were just a little bit, off center, a little weird, a little odd, and a little bit out of season. So they could fit together under the title Out of Season. And then I organized them just simply in terms of how they seemed best to flow one into the other. I didn't set out to write a collection. I didn't set out to do a themed collection of linked stories or anything like that. I just, collected a bunch of stories and then tried to put them into a collection.
Awesome. Thank you. Chaitali.
Yeah, it's the same. I mean, I didn't set out to write a collection. I'm sure most writers do think that at some point, if you're writing short fiction, you'll have a book length collection. But it wasn't really on my radar until I had enough stories. Most of them were about immigrants and migration and race. So I had 10 stories that I put together. I always knew what I wanted to be the first and the last story. Everything else in the middle, I sort of played around with order, and some of that decision was on the length of the stories, point of view, things like that. You want some variation. And so 8 of those stories, we actually cut 2 of the stories, I think. We cut 2 of the stories, so 8 made it in. And I submitted it to the contest, the Sarah Mary McCarthy Prize. I never asked my agent to shop a short story collection for me. That's how not on my radar it was.
Well, I'd actually love to talk a little bit about the prizes, because both of your collections are prize winners. Kirk's, your collection won the Elixir Press Fiction Award, and your collection, Chaitali, won the Mary McCarthy Prize in Short Fiction. And so can you just talk about the process of submitting the collections and what that looked like for you and what it even means to have won a prize? And so Chaitali, I'll stick with you and then we'll come to you, Kirk.
It means everything. It's an amazing boost to your self-confidence, and because I quiet as it's kept, writers are very insecure. Maybe it's not kept that quiet, but I was about a pretty low ebb, just struggling with publication and writing my novel. And so when I got the news, I really didn't believe it. I mean, I think the important thing about prizes is there are a lot of them out there. You should look and see, what they publish, who's won that, and is this a press you would like to publish with? So it's like literary magazines. You still need to do some research and find out about the press, and then make sure you follow their guidelines. If it's an anonymous submission, don't put your name anywhere on that damn manuscript. And then to move on, submit it and move on, work on other stuff. And then a year later, I guess, you might get a nice phone call. So
yeah. Yeah, one of the dirty secrets these days is that winning awards is one of the few ways for writers to get published. It's really, really hard, especially with short story collections, but it's hard with anything to get published in book form. And one of the open routes for writers is to win a prize, because a prize usually involves publication. So both Chaitali and I got there this way. It's difficult to do it any other way, and that's really unfortunate. It's true, because these contests tend to have 500 entries or whatever, and so they tend to have readers who may be wonderful readers, but they're reading a lot of stuff. I've been readers for those contests, and I know you get kind of your brainwash gets overwhelmed after a while, and you're reading stuff that may not be to your taste or whatever, but it may still be wonderful, and it's difficult not to gravitate toward what's to your taste. So it's a hard process, but it's a very necessary process, and one of the few ways that you can do it. I submitted to contests again over several years, and I was, a finalist a bunch of times, and a semifinalist, and so forth and so on. So I just kept on going, and eventually, won a contest and got published. It's a good exercise, and another reason it's a good exercise is the literary journals really support themselves by the fees they get for people entering their contests. And it's hard to do literary journals these days and hard to keep them alive. And by submitting to contests and paying that fee, which may be $20, 25 bucks, whatever, you are keeping that journal going.
I think just to clarify too, there are different kinds of prizes. So there are the prizes that get you publication, which
Right.
is what Kirk and I got. And then there are prizes like once your book is out or once you're published, maybe there's an editor's prize or your book gets nominated for a prize and you maybe win some money or some prestige. So that's not the prize we're talking about. We're talking about actually submitting, winning, and then getting published because of that prize.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. So I want to end our discussion, which, can you believe it, is already coming to a close, with some recommendations, short story recommendations, short story collection recommendations, because if you're reading or if you're writing short fiction, you should probably be reading it as well. So Kirk, do you have any recommendations, any books that you return to or just really want to make sure that the audience knows they should definitely be reading?
Strangely, I do. At the top of my list would be The Visiting Privilege, a collection by Joy Williams. I love Joy Williams. I love her, the way she does sentences, the way she puts together so much meaning into stories that may be totally weird, but the more you look at them, the more meanings they have. There's a collection by George Saunders I like a lot called 10th of December, came out a few years ago, and a new one called Liberation Day from George Saunders, a couple of really nice stories in there. Karen Russell, I like, of course, several of her collections. I was going to mention, though, an older one called St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves. Has some wonderful stories in it, like Karen Russell. As far as individual stories go, I think a very interesting one is a story by Lori Moore called Dance in America. That's a good story to learn structure from, and also wonderful language. It's one of those examples where she does what I was talking about earlier. She puts the end in the middle. At some point, she made the decision that she was going to reveal the end and then go on and wrap up some things. And it really, really works well, beautifully in this story. You find it in her collection, Birds of America. So Dance in America by Lori Moore. And then a Joy Williams short story that's in the same collection I mentioned, The Visiting Privilege. It's called Congress. And it has absolutely nothing to do with Congress. But like so many Joy Williams stories, it's beautiful and strange. And it has a lamp in it that's made out of a deer's foot. And a lot of strange magical stuff happening that isn't really admitted to be magical, like all of Joy Williams.
Thank you. Tweety?
Yeah, there are so many great short story writers and examples and collections out now. I really feel like the short story collection is having a bit of a revival.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, there are amazing ones. I think what I want to recommend, though, one of my favorites, and these are maybe not very well known names, I'm going to shout out a few of my South Asian sisters. So Nina McConaughey wrote a collection that's set in Wyoming called Cowboys and East Indians. And there's a story in there that was in American short fiction called Curating Your Life. And that's a story that I return to over and over again. You may be able to find it even on the American short fiction site. I don't know. And Sharbari Zora Ahmed had an early collection called The Ocean of Mrs. Nagai, and she has a new collection coming out, I think, in the summer. And finally, Sindhya Banu, who graduated from the Michener Center, had a book that came out, I think, last year or the year before, called Seeking Fortunes Elsewhere. They're fairly simple structurally, but complex in terms of meaning. So I think they're really good stories to look at and sort of use as models if you're whether you're writing your first short story or your 50th.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. So for our audience, we're going to open it up to questions now. So if you have a question for our panelists, please add it to the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. So first up, are all the submissions paid or not paid? Chaitali, do you want to take a shot at this one?
So early on, I was not paid. So I just, I wanted to see my story in print, or I wanted to see it published. So I didn't really pay attention to whether I was getting paid or not. And the sad fact is the vast majority of places that publish short fiction don't have a budget to pay you. But now I only submit to places that pay. And, it's really okay when you're starting out. And it's not to say that these are not good journals. They were great journals. I got to learn the editorial process, and I got to build up a publication history. So, the writing is not a way to make a lot of money. So, it's nice to get paid, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kirk, what is a pushcart?
What is a pushcart? Pushcart is an annual anthology, and the journals make nominations for pushcart authors, and pushcart accepts some of those and publishes those, and that's called a pushcart prize when you get published in that annual anthology.
Awesome, thank you. All right, next question. How do you like to read short stories in journals, but do you sit down and read a bunch in a series like it's a novel, or do you pick one up when you feel like it? And I'd love to hear both of your answers to this question. So Kirk, if you want to start.
I think one of the beauties of short stories is that you can do one in an hour a lot of times. You don't have to sit, dedicate weeks to it like you might to a novel. And so what I tend to do is read individual stories and pick the book back up later.
Yeah, I'd say, I totally read, if I have a short story collection, I'll read it, out of order or at different times. It might be, I don't read it like a novel at all. And also, if you subscribe, or I don't think you even have to subscribe to the New Yorker podcast, you can listen to stories on your way to Houston or wherever you're going. So I'm just looking for stories all the time to read, and I'll read them anyway. any way I have time to do it, I'll make time. There are no rules about it.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so what advice do you have for writers who might get into an overthinking loop during the revision process? So much so that you don't even know what sounds good anymore. And I think I'd love to hear from both of you for this one as well. So any advice for writers who are overthinking during revision? Chaitali?
It's hard. I've revised things and then gone back to original, undone the revision. I think the biggest piece of advice I can give you is figure out what the story's about and let that be your guiding star.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. The other thing is to get away from it for a while. Put it away, put it on the shelf. Don't think about it. Do something else, do anything else, write something else or read something else or take a walk for 3 days. But then go back and look at it with a fresh eye. Because one of the things about overthinking is that your brain just starts spinning, and it's good to give it a chance to settle down and stop, and then go back, and oftentimes you realize, oh, that's what I missed about this editing process.
Thank you. Next question. Do you attend writing or critique groups for your short fiction to get feedback before you submit? Kirk?
Yes, and that's very, very important. It happens that I'm in a writing group with my friend Chaitali, and have been for years. So most of the stories in both of our books we had seen in various drafts before they found their way into a book. But it's very important part of the process to get feedback from people that you trust, and to pay attention to that feedback, and to look at if something is already bothering you. That's kind of my rule. If something about a story is already bothering me and someone says something about that particular thing, I know I need to work on that particular thing. And the group is very, very good at giving me that kind of guidance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important on so many levels to find some trusted readers. Sometimes it's just for moral support. Sometimes it's, most often it's because they actually really help you with your stories. And in the case of the Catholics, my writing group was absolutely critical because I had half the story and I was like, what do I do with this? And they said, you got to bring back the Catholics. You would think I'd have been able to come up with that on my own, but I couldn't. So
thank you.
And I'm not ashamed to admit it.
All right, looks like we have a couple questions in the chat box as well. So for Kirk, I love tapioca, and the botanist character remind me so much of Melville's Bartleby. Did you see your botanist as being on the autism scale? Our book club thought Bartleby was.
I do think the botanist is unusual mentally. He's very, very focused, and whether he's on the autism scale, I don't know, but I think that would be as likely as anything else.
Thank you. So the next question. For visual artists, there are national lists to enter for contests. Is there a national organization that posts all the contests or writers? Troy?
Poets and Writers, pw.org. That's where you can find out. I think they even have a tab or, a list in the tab that says writing contests. So that's where I go to look for almost anything writing, related to the publishing world or literary journals. I go to Poets and Writers magazine.
Yeah, I'll second that. And that tab is called Publish Your Writing. And underneath that, you'll find contests and journals and lots of stuff.
Great, thank you. Next question. When you share pages with others for feedback, are you giving them physical pages or electronic versions? And we can hear from both of you.
These days we send over email, or I guess we always did this, send over email, the electronic version, and then we print them out. So I guess both, but I think everybody, I find the screen lies and I really have to read things on paper if I'm going to really be able to give good feedback.
Yeah, I'm old school about paper too. Printed on paper is good. In our writing group, as Shorty says, we get it electronically, we print it out and we mark it up physically. And typically we give the writer back that marked up copy with suggested edits and comments and so forth, as well as a sort of summary about how the story impressed us and any questions that we had or things we might want the writer to pay attention to going forward.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Next question. For Kirk, where do you find these spreadsheet strategies you mentioned?
I made it up. Now you can also find various ways online. What's that one called, Shorty? Maybe you can help. There's a submission system online that you can go to.
Oh, well, there's Duotrope and Submittable.
There you go, Duotrope, and well, Submittable is something that the magazines use, but they also have some support for you. But yeah, Duotrope, has a system. You can pay them a little money and use their system for submitting. Mine, I just built over time. I hand built it. And what I do is I have a different spreadsheet. I don't want to go into too much detail here. We'll all fall asleep, but I have a spreadsheet for each work that I'm submitting. I have an overall spreadsheet of upcoming deadlines, and I have a spreadsheet of submissions out. That shows everything I have out to every. So basically, I'm working off 3 different spreadsheets each time.
Thank you. Next question. How do you know when a story is done? Jordy?
Oh, yeah, okay. On some level, it's never really done, but when I look back at it a few weeks later or months later, and I still think it's good. When I read the ending after some time has passed and it still resonates with me. When I feel like, okay, if this went into print right now, as of today, would I still feel proud of it? And I answer, sure. Now, I don't know, that can change from day to day, but at some point you feel like this is good, and I'm happy to put my name on it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although with the caveat that for me, I tend to get too excited early and think this is done. I want it to be done, but oftentimes it's not. And oftentimes I need to get away from it, like I said, and go back and look at it again, realize it's not done, or send it to the writing group and realize that it's not done, and work on it some more. Usually things are not done after the 5th draft or so. They need some more work after.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. It looks like we have gone through all of the questions so far. So to our audience, definitely buy both of these collections. They are wonderful collections. We're going to drop the link in the chat box to check to book people, so you can both support an independent bookstore and also these authors. But it was great speaking to the both of you. Thank you to everyone who came, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. This was really fun. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah, those were great questions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.